today I'm going to be making a sleeve for my quilt. So a sleeve is so that you can hang it in an exhibition or a quilt show, and it will enable the exhibitors to be able to hang it. So usually they're a tube that's stitched to the back of the quilt. You can make them removable if you like. And it just goes through that back layer, so it's the very last thing you do. So this is a finished quilt. This is the one that I want to add one to. This is a bit of a weird shape though. It's kind of a round shape. Most of the time you will know how big to make your sleeve because you're going to be making it for probably a square or a rectangular quilt, like this one. I might need to make a sleeve for this one as well, I'm not sure yet. I'm going to make one today for this dog quilt, my Hank Potato quilt, because I know that that's got into a show. I've not had the email through that says how big the sleeve should be yet, but often the quilt shows will give you instructions on what they want you to have. So usually it's things like how they want you to do the binding, make sure that a quilt is 3 layers, make sure your quilt's no bigger than X amount in total. But also they may say that they need the sleeve to be 2 inches or 3 inches, or a minimum of. But if I was going to make it for this quilt, I know that I would need to measure. So I'll just get my little tape measure out. The width of the quilt. I am going to take a little less because I don't want it to be stitched to the binding. So I will take that measurement. Also, we will lose a little bit of the width as well when we finish the edges. Just measuring this, I'm just allowing kind of 1/2 inch on the inside of the quilt. I'm going to make it 32.5 inches for this particular quilt. So I'm going to take a measurement for my actual quilt that I want to make, and I'm going to note that down, or at least note it in your head. Now the difficulty with these rounder quilts is you're not sure quite where the point is, where it's not going to kind of twist, so that you get the balance right, because it's quite bottom heavy. It's got quite a big bum on this quilt. And I also have to remember where the top is. So the top is actually just here. So I might just put a little pin in there just to remind myself. So that's my centre point now, that's where I know that the top's going to be. And then I'm going to have to kind of guess, to be honest. I'm not sure quite how far down it's going to need to go to get the balance, but if you're too far down, you're going to end up with a floppy top. So that's why with the square quilts, they're a lot easier. You're probably just going to stay something like 2 inches from the very top. Not that that actually matters at this point, because with the rectangular quilt, they're the same all the way down, so you don't need to worry about what the width is. You just need to measure the width at any point, because hopefully you've squared up that quilt enough that that makes sense. I'm going to assume I'm going to have to keep it reasonably high up. I'm just going to use 2 rulers on mine. I'm going to use this one so that I keep the straight middle point, and then I'm going to butt the other ruler up against it so I know that I have this straight. And I'm actually just going to draw a line on mine. I might end up moving it because my ruler isn't quite long enough, so I am still going to have to measure it with a tape measure. I'm going to make my sleeve out of muslin. So I've chosen this just because it's a cheap material, but I back my wall quilts with this stuff anyway, so it's a good match. I probably wouldn't make a sleeve out of denim or something heavy. Probably keep it to quilting cotton or something like that. Okay, so we're going to measure. I'm going to go from the binding this time, just because I might have to make it bigger. So I'm going to say this is 28 inches. So I'm going to cut a piece of fabric now that's 28 inches, and then the width needs to be twice what the tube width says it needs to be. So I know I've got at least 28 inches this way because it's folded like 4 times. I'm just going to use my mat to square this bit at the end up. Because I'm left-handed, it would be easier if I'd cut from the inside of the table. So I'm going to make my cut, but I also need to remember to put my seam allowance in there, which is 1/4 inch at each side. So I actually, because I'm going to be sewing this into a tube, I need to cut 8.5 inches if I want a 4-inch tube. So let's count those. 1 inch, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8 is there, and then I add a ½ inch for my seam allowance. Check it straight, and I'm happy with that. And then cut. And then I'm going to be reducing this down to 28 inches. It is on the fold, so I'm actually just going to line that up with a line on my mat, because it doesn't have to be the most accurate thing. And then I'm going to cut at 14 inches. Notice how I'm not bothering to add the seam allowance now, because I know that I want it to be a little bit smaller at the end, because you don't want the sleeve to show on the back of the quilt, on the front of the quilt. You only want it on the back. So let's count that one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 inches, which will be 28 because the fold is here. So this is going to be our sleeve. All right, so you can starch and press this if you wish. I'm just going to get rid of that fold. If you're wondering what I'm using, it's just Best Press. I do find that sometimes that sticks to my iron, which is a bit weird, especially with muslin. My machine just has normal cotton in there. I would just use either just 50 weight or whatever you've got. Again, it's only a sleeve, it's not hugely important, but if it's going to a show, I guess you might want to put a little bit more effort in. So to begin with, we want to finish the edges, so the shorter edges. I tend to do this by eye. I kind of fold it under, and then I fold it again. So I will end up with a fold like this, and then I stitch down there, and I do that both sides. You can measure it if you wish, so if you want to find where that 1/4 inch is, you can do that, and then you can also press it with the iron as you go if you wish, and then you fold it again, and you just use where the raw edge comes up to as your guide for your second fold, so you don't need to measure it twice. You might want to press it twice though. Oh, it's hot. Okay, so we're doing this twice. This is going to be the front of the sleeve. This is going to be the inside of the sleeve. And we're just going to stitch that down with a regular stitch. And I'm stitching mine from the front because I know where that fold is. I can see through the muslin, it's pretty thin. Right, off we go. Okay, so I sewed it from the front, it cut all of the back. I'm just going to do that for the other end. Make sure that you fold it in the same direction so you don't end up with a seam on the one side and a seam on the other. So my seam's on this side, I'm folding this to the same side. Alright, so now we have 2 seams, but we still have these longer edges to contend with. But what is actually going to happen is we're going to make it into a tube. So your seams should actually be on the inside. You're going to be folding the wrong sides together. So when you fold it, you'll have that seam on the inside. And you're just going to match those long edges all the way down, and then you're going to sew that with a 1/4 inch. What you're going to do next is you're going to go back to your iron, and you're going to open that seam, and you're going to press that seam open. And to be able to press it open, you kind of have to unfold where it was, so it kind of lays differently now. That seam is right down the middle. Mine is slightly wonky, but that's okay, as long as it stays all on the same edge and it doesn't roll around to the other side, we're good. Okay, so actually we've made our sleeve now. There's our seam, nicely pressed on that side. This will be the front of the sleeve, and this will be on the back. So let's take it back to the quilt. Okay, so first I'm going to show you where I'd position it on a rectangular quilt if I had made the sleeve for this quilt, because I know most of the time if you're watching a video like this, this is the sort of shape that you'll be wanting to use the sleeve on. So what I would do now is get the probably my quilting ruler for this size quilt, and just make sure I know where somewhere about 3 inches is from the top. I'm actually going to do 3 inches from the binding. We don't want to be a whole lot more than that. We don't want the top to be floppy. And we're going to position the sleeve. So normally the sleeve would be slightly longer because this is a wider quilt than the one that I'm working with, and you'll find that it's easier to center it. You'll leave a similar amount of space at each end of the quilt. So you'll leave something like half an inch or an inch, might at the very most, will be left over after measuring it and then losing those little bits when you folded the edges under. So it will be a lot easier to center. You won't actually have to measure from the edges. So imagine this is centered. And I'm making sure it's evenly 3 inches all the way down. And then what I will do is I'll get my pins. So I get my safety pins and I'm just going to pin it along the top. I'm only going to do 1 or 2 since this is just a quick demo. I'm just going to keep my ruler there as long as I can, just to make sure that I'm keeping it square. And those pins, they can go through the front if you want. You're not actually stitching it. This isn't permanent. We're actually going to have to hand sew it in place. So I'm just going to stick 3 pins in. I'd maybe suggest on a quilt this size doing at least 5 and having 1 in between. Okay, so I can move my ruler now. And then what you're going to do is make sure that this can kind of make a 3D-ish shape. So you're going to give it a little bit of volume. The bottom is still going to be flat. You're just almost making it like a D shape. So there's a bit of a curve on the top, but the back is going to be still laying flat. So what I mean by that is, if you've pressed it, you can sort of almost see a little line when you press that seam open. You can roll that to the front slightly. And by slightly, I mean by about 1/4 of an inch. It's only going to be a very small amount. And then you're going to pin that again, just to stop that from moving, because that's going to be the hardest bit to keep. That bit is going to be the bit that you forget when you sew it down. When you sit in front of the TV and you're hand sewing it, yeah, it's the bit you're going to forget to make sure that you have just a little bit of give in that tube. So it actually is a tube rather than just a flat piece of fabric. And I will show you how to do this on an irregular shaped quilt as well, because I will show you where I'm going to sew it myself for my hank potato quilt. So this is how it looks now. Next thing I will do is I'll get some cotton thread, or I might even use my Deco Bob thread. And then I'm going to sew the tube to the back of the quilt. And it's only going to go through the back layer. We don't want to see any stitches on the front. And then you're just going to sew it like you sew binding. Take a little stitch, little nick of the sleeve into the fabric, little nick of the sleeve into the fabric. When you get to the ends, I would recommend doing the same, but only for the bottom of the tube. So you keep this bit open, but this is still stitched down. You could, of course, leave this free, but then it's almost like you leave almost a secondary tube behind it. So it's probably best if you do that. But if you take kind of reasonably large stitches, not too big because you still want it to take the weight of the quilt, you don't want to damage the back of the quilt, but you can then cut those stitches later on if you want to take the sleeve off, and then you can use the sleeve for something else. So that is how to do it on a rectangular quilt. I'm just going to unpin it now, and I'm going to attach it to the quilt I actually want to attach it to. And we're probably going to use more than the 6 safety pins this time. Maybe. We'll see. I'm quite lazy when it comes to pins. Now, I'm glad that I marked my little line on it before, because that means I don't have to put the ruler on and try and figure it out. Okay, so again, seam goes on the back. I'm going to line it up with that yellow little pencil line. You probably can't see it because I'm struggling to see it. And I'm going to make sure that's reasonably centered. Okay, so I've got my point from the binding. You can't really see that either. It's about 1/2 inch maybe. And it's about 1/2 inch at the other side. With this though, I'm not sure if it's going to be balanced. So I'm just going to put those 6 pins in first, but we will need to check the balance. So now I'm just going to take a piece of dowel, put it through the tube and see how it hangs. So I've just used those clips for now. My marker where the middle of my quilt's staying there, because I just want to see how that works. Let me go grab a piece of dowel. All right, this is quite a long piece. I might regret this. I should have probably picked up a smaller piece. Okay, so I'm going to go through my sleeve. I've not sewn it on yet because I want to make sure that it hangs correctly before I do that. Otherwise I'll have to unstitch it and start again, and that'll be really sad. Okay, Does that hang straight? And do I have enough at the top where it's not folding down? Because that, if it hung like this, that would be really quite annoying. You want to make sure it does hang like that. My thought is I might have to move it up a little bit because there is still a chance that it will do this, but not by much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it up until it's actually touching the binding of the quilt. But I think that's quite central. All right, so I'm unpinning it and I'm going to move it to the top a little bit more. Not much, because again, the top on mine is thinner. Like if you were making a quilt as a circle, you've got a lot less tube to support the rest of the quilt. And that's scary. Okay, so let's go a little bit higher up. Can't really go any higher than that. I will check to make sure it's straight. This binding's in the way, so what I could do is I could take it to my machine. I could chop off the end, re-sew that bit, you know, having unsewn a bit of this longer seam, and then fold it again, but I'm quite lazy, so I'm going to see if I can get away with not doing that. Okay, so my straight edge. So rather than me measuring from the top and saying, oh, it's this amount of inches, I can't really do that in this case. I just have to make sure it's straight. So we're taking it about, according to my ruler anyway, about 1.25 inches higher up. Where's my marker pencil? Which means that my previous yellow line will be underneath the sleeve. Okay. So I'm going to line that up again, make sure it's central, pin it in place and hand sew it like I mentioned. And you'll see that seam that you made that with the raw edges is going to be tucked away on the back, no one's going to see that. And that's how you sew a sleeve to the back of a quilt.